everyone. Welcome. We're very excited to be here with you today to kick off our Lenten season, and we're doing that with the author of our recommended Lent resource, Gayle Boss, and she's joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. So, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. So we just, for our viewers who are joining us, we have people tuning in all the way from Canada and across the US. So we're excited to have a very international audience today. So just to go through some housekeeping notes for tonight before we turn over to Gayle, we just wanted to make sure that people know that we'll be having a Q&A session later in the session. As you're watching right now, you can begin to comment and post your questions. And then when we get to the Q&A session time, you'll be able to see your questions come up, and then we can go through the questions. But we're very excited as the Climate Witness Project to be partnering with Gayle, especially recommending her book because it is a very perfect theme for Lent. And so we're very excited to see, just to talk a little bit with her about her motivation behind the book and writing the book and what really spurred her on. We also wanted to let everyone know that Steve Mulder here, who is our coordinator for our Climate Witness Project, will spend some time just giving us some snapshot of the Lent challenge that we have ongoing during the season of Lent and how you can get involved and connected as well. So that's just sort of our agenda for tonight. If you already do not have the book, the Wild Hope book, we really encourage you to have that. Again, you can see the link below that really shows how you can purchase the book. There are discussion questions that goes along with the book as well. And so please do well to have that because Lent begins tomorrow and we are starting strong. So please make sure you have that with you. So anything else before we turn over to Gayle? Okay, awesome. So Gayle, we're going to turn over to you, and just to, again, like we said, listen to the motivation behind the book, why this is important for us in our time right now, and how, as people of faith, we can really lean into Lent with this theme in mind. And so, it's all you.
Well, thank you. I'm so honored that you've chosen Wild Hope to be the recommended reading for Climate Witness Partners. Really, I am. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the story. I would tell the story of how I happened to write this book, why I wrote it in the way I did, and what I hope people, readers, will take away from the book. You know, there have been just a few times in my life, a handful of times in my life when I have felt compelled to take a particular path, and writing Wild Hope was one of them. It was really during Advent of 2016, when I sensed that the Spirit had this wild idea. My first book, All Creation Waits, had just been released. For those of you who don't know it, it's a book about animals of the Northern Hemisphere and the amazing adaptations they make when they're faced with the threat of dark and cold. And it offers, too, a spiritual word to us humans about what we might do when faced with a season of dark and cold. Well, that book was out in the world, and I was wondering, I wonder what I will write next. I really didn't know. In my prayers, I was hearing one word. I was hearing the word suffering. And I knew that the voice speaking that word to me meant specifically, of all the kinds of suffering in the world, wild animal suffering. I knew generally that many species were threatened, were suffering by the intrusion of our lives into their lives. But really, I was aware of only the most public examples, like the poaching of elephants for their tusks and the distress of polar bears in a warming Arctic. Looking back, I think that I was afraid to look directly at the suffering of species, a suffering that's so vast now that biologists tell us we are in the Earth's 6th mass extinction of species. I avoided that suffering until in one particular photo, that suffering looked out at me and I couldn't look away. It was a photo of 8 baby orangutans in a wheelbarrow. I was at my parents' house for Christmas in 2016, and I saw the new issue of National Geographic on a table. I picked it up and I riffled through it, and I saw this story on orangutans with that picture of the orangutan orphans in a wheelbarrow. It took my heart. I couldn't look away, but scanning the photo, the caption, the stories, I knew that I was going to be very un-Christmassy company if I continued to read that story. So I put it at the bottom of the stack of the magazines and I tried to forget about that photo. But it kept swimming into my imagination like early in the morning when I would be waking up. So finally I gave in. I went to the library, I found the issue of National Geographic, and I read the story. That was Christmastide of 2016. A few days after that, I had an email from a woman I had met just once. She emailed me to say that on January 5th of 2017, she was going to be in Grand Rapids and could we meet for lunch? And I said, sure, not aware at all of what she might want to talk about. We met at a local bookstore, and before I even had one bite of lunch in my mouth, she handed me an article from Audubon magazine on the amazing little shorebird, the red knot. And she said, this is what you should write next. This is your next book. Well, between the story about the orangutans and the story about the imperiled red knot, the wave of animal suffering around the world caught me up. The top layers of me did not want to investigate further animal suffering, but the deeper layers of me knew that this was my calling, that this was a project I was called to do at this time in my life. There was one other card the Spirit of God pulled to persuade me that this project was the project for me at this time in my life. At the same time that I saw the photograph of the baby orangutans and I read the article on the red knot, 2 readers of All Creation Waits emailed me from opposite ends of the country with the very same question. Father Rick Lawler in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, and Heather Young in Seattle both emailed to say, would you consider writing a sequel to All Creation Waits, a sequel for Lent? Well, I resisted that too. That just seemed so formulaic to me. You know, woman writes book about animals for Advent, woman writes book about animals for Lent, and I did not want to be that woman. But as soon as my ego got out of the way, I saw that a book about the suffering of species being extinguished on our planet was a perfect theme for Lent. Lent, I learned the word Lent, our English word Lent, comes from an old English word, the word Lenten, L-E-N-C-T-E-N, Lenten, meaning springtime. And that old English word in turn comes from a West Germanic word, langitinas, which means the lengthening of days. So Lent, our word, at its root means the season of lengthening days, springtime. Well, in springtime, things grow. In that season of lengthening days, things made of earth, including us, our bodies were made of earth, we grow biologically and theologically. We're drawn, we're designed to thaw, to open, to grow in this season of springtime. That's why we call spring the season of love, I think. So I saw that Lent, springtime, would be a perfect time for a book for all of us to grow in our love of all creation. I am persuaded now, especially after doing the research for this book, I am persuaded that only a greater love, a larger compassion for others unlike ourselves, whether it's other classes or races or genders or species, only a larger love than anything we have ever known, individually and corporately, is going to pull us back from the brink of devastation of all creation. Only love can do that. Policies, facts, arguments, exposés, necessary as they are, cannot make the change. They're necessary outgrowths, but they don't seed the change. The seed of the change is only in love, because we only protect and save over the long haul what we love. Well, I knew that by committing myself to this journey, I was really begging the question, how do we grow in love for all creation, individually and corporately? If I'm going to write about growing in love for all creation, how do we grow in love for all creation? Well, when I wrote All Creation Waits, I could spend time in the Calvin Ecosystem Preserve, which is a 5-minute walk from my back door. I could spend time with the animals in that book, with the muskrat on the ice, with the deer in the woods, with the red fox in the field. I could spend time with them, agenda-less time. And that's how we grow in our love, whether it's for a human member of creation or a non-human member of creation. We spend time with them, time without an agenda. But if I was going to write a book about endangered animals around the globe, North Atlantic right whales, staghorn coral, polar bears, if I was going to write a book about those animals, how would I spend time with them to grow in my love for them and to help readers grow in their love for them? Thinking about that, I looked to Jesus. I thought, when Jesus, who knew himself beloved, when he wanted to convey to us that we are deeply beloved and that we can open our hearts and love all others, what did he do? He told a story. He said, a man had 2 sons, a woman had 2 coins, a shepherd had 100 sheep. Stories and pictures that tell stories have the power to draw us into their worlds, to melt our defenses and transform us before we know what's happening, so that we're different on the other end. I like to think about Lucy in the Narnia stories. She goes through the wardrobe into Narnia as a silly, sometimes foolish little girl. But she's transformed inside the story into Queen Lucy the Valiant. That's the power of living inside a story. Well, believing that, I thought maybe I could write a book of stories about wild, endangered creatures that would draw us into the animals' world, where our defenses would thaw and melt, and we could see these creatures as expressions of God's own self, of God's own suffering. And that inside the stories of these animals, like Lucy, we could grow up. We could grow up so that we too were bonded to beavers and lions. We could grow up to be queens and kings, valiant in the defense of all creatures. Because that's who I want to be. I want to be a person so in love with creation that I dare to take bolder actions to protect creation, bolder than I've heretofore been willing to make. Because I think we only protect and save what we really love. Now, I knew that by investigating species extinction, I was going to come up hard against suffering. Elephants and rhinos with their faces hacked off by machetes, pangolins force-fed a limestone slurry to bloat them so that they weigh more and bring more money per pound to their traffickers, polar bears and their cubs drowning in seas where there are no ice flows, giant river otters poisoned by the mercury used to mine gold. St. Paul says all creation groans in this one great act of giving birth. I knew that I was going to experience the groaning of all creation. What I didn't know was whether inside that groaning I would sense the impending birth that Paul talks about. I didn't know whether I would sense a resurrection. Now, my faith, The story of Jesus, the Hebrew scriptures, the letters of Paul, all of those say that within and beyond the worst suffering, there's a resurrection. But I didn't know if I was going to find it, and I didn't want to start there. I didn't want to start proclaiming a cheap joy. I didn't want to start with a dogma of certain resurrection if the facts of species extinction didn't support it. I wanted to do an honest investigation of the facts of species extinction and see where they led me, to see if it was indeed seated with resurrection. I think I was prepared to say that it isn't, that species extinction is so grim and so bleak, so dire a situation. There is no new life offered to us in it. That if God has something new in all of this death, then God isn't giving us any hints of what it looks like. That I was prepared, I think, to say there is no hope is evidenced by the fact that the working title of this book, which came to be called Wild Hope, I'll try to hold it there for you. The first working title of the book was not Wild Hope. It was All Creation Groans. The title changed, first of all, because my editor said, Gayle, nobody is going to buy a book with groans as the main word in the title. But the title also changed because, something to my surprise, as I began to investigate the suffering of species and their extinction, I began to find seeds of hope, small seeds to be sure, seeds that may not seem big enough to count as hope for some readers, but seeds that I like to think are the seeds like those in the story of Jesus, the mustard seeds. Seeds so small that you don't see them unless you get up close. But seeds that, if they're watered, can grow into the largest of shrubs, a shrub that can give rest to all the wandering birds of the air. The seeds of hope that I found as I did my research, the seeds of hope that I wrote into the book, are the men and women devoted to the care, the protection of the animals that they love. They have cherished these animals, they're suffering with them, and they're protecting them. Those people are the seeds of hope, and they themselves are planting seeds of hope. Every day they take actions to create what they hope and pray will be a resurrection of orangutans, a resurrection of pangolins and leopards and lemurs and panthers. They're doing that every day. They're not only the seeds of hope themselves and planting seeds of hope for the creatures, I think that by their actions, grounded in love, they're also planting seeds within their own lives, seeds of hope for themselves. These small, seemingly dismissible actions that they are taken out of love, out of those, God is growing great new possibilities for human community, individuals and communities as a whole. Now, we're never going to see the throngs of orangutans and pangolins and leopards and lemurs that roamed the earth when my grandparents were young. But in the years since my grandparents were young, an awe for wild creatures has grown and is spreading across the globe. I believe it's a contagion of compassion for wild creatures. It's a contagion that's not spreading fast enough. They're seeds of hope that are not large enough, maybe, for some to count as seeds of hope. But I think that within those seeds, there's an explosive force. It's the explosive force of love that St. Paul tells us created the universe. And it's that explosive force also, Paul tells us in the 8th chapter of in the 3rd chapter of Ephesians, it's that explosive force that is able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond anything we can ask or imagine. It's that contagion of compassion for wild creatures that I hope readers will catch when they read Wild Hope, or that they will have fanned into an even larger compassion. Because I really believe that we will only, over the long haul, protect and save what we love. So that's the story of how I wrote the book, why I wrote the book that I did write, and what I hope readers will take from it. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the book that people might have.
You really, I think, struck something in me as we're going through about the whole idea of love, and I would like to get to that a little bit before we get our questions. But just for a reminder for our viewers, you can send in your questions by commenting and posting your questions, and then we will filter those questions through for Gayle to answer them. And again, just wanted to remind you that we taking a journey through Wild Hope. The book is paired with our Lent challenge, which Steve will speak a little more about. But the goal is for us to reduce our reliance on single-use plastics. So each week we come up with a new category of single-use plastics that we can reduce our reliance on. And we have, again, all that on our website. So just want to remind you, and again, please feel free to comment and put in your questions through, and then we'll get through that. So, Steve.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Gayle. The question that I had, you said the title of the book, of course, Wild Hope, makes you think of hope for the wild, but also that maybe this is a wild hope.
Yeah.
Thinking that there could be some way out of this situation. So you said one of the things that gives you hope are people. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I do in the book. It's all the portraits of all the people within each story of an animal that's facing the danger of extinction. It's all the people who are devoting their lives to the care of these creatures, descending down beneath lakes that are at the bottom of caves to find a salamander that's just a foot long, devoting their lives to caring for these orangutans, following red knots on their 9,500-mile journey from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic and back, whose whole lives have been given in love to these creatures. That's really the root of my hope and my belief that that kind of love is explosive and has results far beyond anything that on the surface we can expect or predict.
We have our first question from our audience, but before I get to that, I just also had a quick question in terms, because in talking, you did talk about the seed of change is love, and I think that was very profound, at least for me here. But I think I would say, how do we balance that with action? Because I think when we think through the climate crisis, when we think through animal extinction, there's a kind of worry and angst about how do we channel all this into tangible action. So how I would say my question is, how do we balance that? How do we make sure that the love translates into tangible action? Because there is a lot of, like I said, angst and anxiety about how do we respond faithfully to the climate crisis. And so, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think actions taken out of a frenzy of anxiety and worry may create a lot of noise and flurry all at once. They may seem effective and they will fizzle out. They will not be effective over the long haul. That only actions that have been rooted in a kind of quiet, contemplative love have staying power and have true force in the world, because there are forces at play that are much larger and invisible to us. So I think that we have to root our action in a concentrated focus on love for a particular creature. I think that's where we have to start. We can't start our action by saying, well, I love all of creation, so I'm just going to do this and this and this and this. What I've encouraged people on retreat to do is to find a particular corner of creation. We don't love a landscape. We love a particular landscape. We love an ecosystem preserve. We love a creek. We love a shoreline. So I encourage people to take a particular landscape or a particular creature, even narrow it down to one creature, and deepen your love for that creature by spending time with that creature, by learning more about that creature, and then what actions you can take in the protection of it, the protection then of creation, will come naturally out of your love for it. As you learn more about orangutans, you'll understand the harmful effects of palm oil, the clearing of rainforests to plant more and more plantations of palm oil trees. And you'll look to see where does palm oil go? And you'll see it's in my shampoo, it's in my lipstick, it's in the cookies I ate this afternoon. It's in 50% of all the products on our supermarket shelves. And you'll begin to think, can I do without these? Are there products made that I need to use? Are there products made without palm oil? So that kind of action then spirals out of our love.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So our first question is from Deborah, and Deborah says, Gayle, do you think that God is creating by the Spirit this contagion of compassion, somehow allowing the creatures to call to us and for us to hear their suffering, perhaps for the first time?
Hi, Deb. And yes, I think that exactly, that it is the Spirit of God that is spreading this contagion of compassion. I know that the creatures are calling to us. You can't watch the videos online of the creatures in their habitat when they're at rest and when they're under threat without feeling their spirits reaching out to us. And you can't see them in interaction with their protectors without knowing that they are reaching out to us or without sensing that. I think that an open heart and a clear mind can't help but sense that. And that's also why we have to ground our action in contemplation so that we can sense what the creatures are calling us to do.
Yeah. Our second question is from Dottie, and it is, how did you do the research about each animal's story, the biological information and the specific ways they are crucified?
Well, the internet is a terrible and a wonderful thing. I started with everything from Wikipedia, not the information in the Wikipedia, but the bibliography at the end to find out who the reputable scientists were that are researching each animal. And then I would go to peer-reviewed journals to read their research on that particular animal. But then I would turn to very popular sources as well for the stories, as in addition to the scientific research. I would read the New York Times, National Geographic, Orion magazine. There were a lot of really good popular sources as well, and I would cross-reference them. And then on the internet, of course, I could watch videos, and I tried to watch the ones that were rooted in the research of a particular scientist whom I had learned about, say Cynthia Moss, for example, who has spent given her life to African elephants. I would watch videos from her organization, Save the Elephants. And I spent many mornings just crying in front of my computer to see the deaths of these creatures, some of them grisly, some of them slow and painful. So I'll summarize that by saying I did everything from read what was for me very dry scientific research, peer-reviewed journals, and I would watch spectacular videos, spectacularly beautiful and spectacularly horrific.
Thanks, Gayle. And this is another question about your process of creating. And so the question from Terry is, how did you connect with your illustrator?
Yeah.
he have your stories shape his illustrations? So was that the process?
Yeah, he is just terrific. I can't say enough about David Klein. Of course, I worked with him on All Creation Waits too, and we used the same process. I wrote the text first, and then I would send David the text, and then I would also send him some of the photographs that had particularly touched me when I was researching that animal. For example, I would send him the photograph of the 8 baby orangutans in the wheelbarrow, and I would send him a photograph of an orangutan mother and child. I would send him a range of photographs, and I would say, I think the heart of the story here, David, is the mother and child. Send me a sketch. And he would sketch an orangutan mother and child, and he would send it back to me and say, what do you think of this? And I would say, I'd like to see more eye contact there. And can the baby not be looking at the mother? Can the baby look out at the... we do that kind of back and forth in order to get just the right illustration that would bring out the heart of the text. And I would say too, for any of you who are writers, that is a pretty unusual process, and I thank Paraclete endlessly, my publisher Paraclete, because most publishers don't let the author and the illustrator talk to one another. A lot of authors have never even met their illustrators. But David and I communicated on every single illustration multiple times, and I count him as a good friend.
Yeah. This is a very, I think, profound, interesting question from Alan Drew in Philadelphia. So Alan says, how would you close the gap for urban poor communities who have little connection with natural places and are struggling just to get by? How can they be drawn into a greater experience of love and wonder for non-human created life?
Wow, that's a great question, and one I'm thinking about because I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I'm right on Capitol Hill, where I'm far from an ecosystem preserve. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I think I would look to those of you who have longstanding experience in urban areas to help me with that. What I do know is that there are urban poor people who are suffering at the same time that these animal communities are suffering. The oil palm plantation workers are working on the oil palm plantations because they're poor and because the palm oil corporations offer them a wage that helps them send their children to school. And I have to face that. Do I want the children of the oil palm plantation workers to go without medical care and schooling? I don't. It gets complex. I also know that those people who are protecting orangutans have looked at this, and they're starting to provide alternative forms of livelihood for the poor people who tend to fall back on those who are persecuting animals. But in terms of American urban communities getting in touch with the non-human community, the wild human community facing extinction, in ways other than the rest of us by learning more and loving more, I think if any of us can simply spend more time with the creatures that we do have, even in our urban corners. I spend time in the dog park across the street from me here in Washington, where there are gray squirrels, and I simply sit and wonder at how miraculous they are, how they have survived in this setting. I don't have a very good answer for that.
If I could just add to that, Gayle, a couple things. I grew up basically in an urban environment, and there was a small little piece of nature that I found as a kid, and me and my friends played there constantly, and we got to know that little piece of nature. And I think lots of folks, if to your earlier comment about particularity and trying to find something that they love in the environment, I think that's an important thing no matter where you live.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would say is, in North America, it's communities of color and more in poor communities that have suffered the most from environmental injustice.
Yes.
this point. So wherever there's going to be an ash pit located, it's going to be near a community of color. And so
Yeah.
we need to be very honest about that, very clear about that, and say, we want to address that. That's a specific thing that's in the here and now. And if we can address that, that's an important thing to get those folks engaged, I think.
Yeah, exactly, Steve. Thanks for reminding of that. In the story about the golden riffle shell mussel, for example, it's about how a tanker truck overturned and spilled a toxic chemical into a river. Well, of course, the water supplies of the people most affected were the poor communities living along the edges of that river. And so exactly, it's often the poorer and urban communities or the poor rural communities that are most affected by pollution, for example, which is one of the sources of extirpation of our wild animal kin.
Great. Yeah, it's this is something I wish we had like more time to get into depth and keep talking, and that's why I am gonna just keep reminding folks to get the book.
It's all there in the book.
Exactly. Yes, it's all there in the book, and you should get a copy of the book again and journey through with the Climate Witness Project on this, because this is something that we really, like you said, the contemplation of it. And I think I like the example you made of like if you focus on a particular species or animal and you develop that love spurs you to take action so that that animal and that the ripple effects of that doesn't happen. So I think that's a really helpful tidbit and tool for us. So